I think we take him off the list and him off the list. I think that's
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. As Dean of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, it's my great privilege to honor and welcome you to the 2019 Paul Volcker Lecture at Syracuse University. First, I'd like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, the firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people upon whose ancestral lands we now stand. I'd like to thank Professor Len Lopo and the team in the Center for Policy Research for organizing today's event. I'd also like to thank Maxwell staff in Information and Computing Technology for their support and Syracuse Catering for their help and assistance with today's event. This is a great occasion for Maxwell to host and engage with renowned economist, historian, and orator, Dr. Deirdre Nansen McCloskey, who is doing innovative work ranging from technical economics and statistical theory to transgender advocacy. Her prolific scholarship, 17 books and 400 scholarly articles on everything ranging from economic theory, economic history, philosophy, rhetoric, feminism, ethics, and law, has been highly recognized, cited, and honored. Today's event also gives us a very special opportunity to acknowledge the many people who have helped make this occasion possible. I'd like to take a moment first to thank someone very special who could not be here today, and that's Paul Volcker himself. The chairman is a member of the Maxwell Advisory Board, and we are honored to have the opportunity to work with him and the Volcker Alliance on important issues of public service. I've spoken with the chairman recently, as well as having visited with him, and his enthusiasm for Syracuse University and the Maxwell School is great, and his ongoing involvement with the Volcker Chair, this annual lecture, and as a member of the Maxwell Advisory Board is invaluable to the school. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Bob Menschel, a Syracuse University graduate and trustee from the class of 1951. Bob is an extraordinary businessman, philanthropist, and a great citizen who has contributed in so many ways to Syracuse University through his time and generosity, and especially in his commitment to the Maxwell School. Bob's remarkable philanthropic support established the Paul Volcker Chair and this wonderful annual program. Behavioral economics is a passion for Bob, and as someone whose distinguished career has focused on the markets and the economy over the long term, we cannot thank Bob enough for the lasting impact his support means to the Maxwell School. And finally, I'm very honored to have the opportunity to introduce to you the Paul Volcker Chair in Behavioral Economics and Maxwell Professor of Public Administration and International Affairs, Dr. Len Berman. Len's the inaugural holder of the Volcker Chair and works both here at the Maxwell School and as a fellow of the Urban Institute, where he's the co-founder of the Tax Policy Center, a joint project of the Urban Institute and the Brookings Institution. Len embodies the tradition of combining the strengths of theory and practice as a thinker, a writer, a teacher, and as a public servant. He exemplifies this in many ways in which one can serve the public good and go beyond, and in Len's case, in government service as well. Throughout his career at the Treasury Department, working with the Congress, as well as his time as a teacher at the Maxwell School, Len Berman reflects the values that Bob Menschel intended to honor and foster by establishing the Volcker Chair at Maxwell, and values which Chairman Volcker has similarly reflected throughout his lifetime. Maxwell is honored by the generosity and service of Paul Volcker, Bob Menschel, and Len Berman. Len, I'm delighted to welcome you to the stage, and thanks so much for organizing this.
Thank you, David, and I also want to thank Paul Volcker and Bob Menschel. It is such an honor to be able to organize this series and to be able to use this program to be able to attract incredible people like Professor McCloskey. It is such a pleasure to introduce Deirdre Nansen McCloskey. She was, until 2015, Distinguished Professor of Economics, History, English and Communication, and Adjunct in Classics and Philosophy at the University of Illinois at Chicago. That's a long way of saying that she is a true Renaissance woman. She was also once a Renaissance man named Donald. Suffice it to say that Professor McCloskey is one of a kind. She made her reputation as an exceptionally analytical and eloquent economic historian, and then followed her interests wherever they led her. At one point, she even tried to learn Greek. It is not the standard recipe for academic success, which is to find a very narrow niche and explore all of its facets until you retire. But it has worked for Professor McCloskey. As Dean Van Slyke mentioned, she's written 18 books, 400 scholarly articles, and numerous pieces geared at a lay audience. She's made contributions to economic theory, economic history, philosophy, rhetoric, feminism, political theory, ethics, and law. Prior to her appointment at UIC, she taught for 12 years at the University of Chicago and for nearly 20 at the University of Iowa, where she was economics department chair for 15 years. This alone proves that she has great endurance. She has received 9 honorary degrees from universities around the world. She won the 2017 Hayek Book Prize, the Hayek Lifetime Achievement Award, and the Adam Smith Prize. Professor McCloskey's award-winning Bourgeois Equality, How Ideas, Not Capital or Institutions Enrich the World, is the third book in a trilogy on how the Western world became rich. I think there's some copies outside. The answer is not more capital or less inequality. Sorry, Thomas Piketty. But economic and political freedoms and respect for the average individual, including the bourgeoisie. The trilogy questions many of the assumptions of traditional economics, which she calls Samuelsonian max utility, and the ideas of the institutionalists. Professor McCloskey likes taking on the economics profession, and she does it with clarity and humor. For example, the Cult of Statistical Significance attacked our obsession with t-statistics and p-values to measure the strength of statistical relationships. To illustrate, she asked us to imagine 2 equally safe diet pills, one called Precision and one called Oomph. Oomph will produce an average weight loss of 20 pounds with a standard error of 10. Precision will trim 5 pounds, standard error 0.5. A well-trained economist would get all excited about Precision, t-statistic of 10, and poo-poo Oomph. But Oomph has about a 90% chance of cutting more weight. Lesson, don't confuse statistical significance for economic significance. This is a lesson, I don't think people have fully absorbed Professor McCloskey's lesson, like we still use t-statistics, but at least it informs some of our analysis, and we don't get excited about results that really are meaningless, usually. She's also been highly critical of economists' writing, which is often incoherent, pompous, and dull. Economical writing is witty, informative, and a succinct 89 pages. She illustrates her 31 bits of advice by violating each one, hilariously. And she's scathing of poor Miss Jones, who taught us how to write badly. This is a quote from the book. Tell the reader what you're going to say it, say that you've said it. I've read that paper many times to my chagrin. According to Deirdre, it is exceptionally bad advice, and the person who made up this memorable phrasing is burning right now in hell. I love that idea. A new edition with 4 more rules for good writing is coming out in May, and it will be on my syllabus. Now she's going to tell us what might be wrong with behavioral economics. Professor McCloskey.
Thank you very much for that graceful introduction. I have a speech defect which will either drive you crazy and then you can run screaming from the room, or you can adjust to it. I usually, in this very busy spring of mine, give talks on the same subject, namely that book there. I'm like a old-fashioned vaudeville performer. I go from town to town with my juggling act, and I can impress the rubes in each town because they haven't heard it. But for the Volcker lecture, I was asked to think, which is quite irritating. And so I'm going to offer some early thoughts on my doubts about behavioral economics. Now, I've been an economist most of my life. I admire and love my friends and even my enemies. I'm a Christian in economics. But I have great doubts about this relative novelty of behavioral economics. I remember its beginnings as an active field when I was at the University of Iowa, Go Hawks, in the 1980s. And I had my doubts then, but being the chair of the economics department, I thought, well, we'll let 1,000 flowers bloom. It was certainly worth trying out. And maybe it's about time to start thinking of some of its problems. For the last century or so, my beloved field of economics has viewed itself as social engineering. In my mad career from teenage Marxism to undergraduate Keynesianism to early graduate school, that's possible too, school as an engineering social engineer. We at Harvard University, we were going to go down in the mid-'60s, go down to Washington and what we said, fine-tune the economy. See, we had it all worked out. Don't worry, we'll take care of you. It reminds me of the old joke, the 3 most unbelievable sentences in English. The check is in the mail. Of course I'll respect you in the morning. And I'm from the government, and I'm here to help you. And we were from the government, and we were going to help y'all. Now, I then became gradually a Chicago school economist. I was the director of graduate studies at Chicago, the famous Chicago School. From 1968 to 80, I was there on the faculty. Those were the glory years when Deirdre was there. And then in 1980, they started to go down. It was a tragedy. And then I started to drift towards, I actually became a teacher of English. I became interested in the rhetoric of economics, having been at Harvard and Chicago when they were at loggerheads and seeing how they persuaded each other. I became interested in science studies, and then gradually got interested in what's called Austrian economics, which has its origin, completely unsurprisingly, in the country of Austria, and is a more humanistic way of thinking about economics. But I didn't feel I should abandon what I had learned before. As a Marxist, I often say that Marxists ask the right questions, and I irritate my friends on the right by saying Marx was the greatest social scientist of the 19th century without compare. And then I irritate my friends on the left by saying, but he got everything wrong. So I've been everything. But what I'd like to recommend to you in my through my criticisms of behavioral economics is my last embodiment, which I call humanomics. Economics with the humans left in. And that doesn't mean you abandon mathematics or statistics. It's not against quantification. I'm still a quantitative girl. I love numbers, 3, 12. They're wonderful. And for some scientific purposes, that's what you need. But you also need the categorization that the humanities provide. The humanities, and in that I would include pure economic theory, is not a matter of magnitudes. It's a matter of yes, no, in, out of categories, good, bad, Homo neanderthalis, Homo sapiens. And before you can count those, you need to know what they are. And that you learn from philosophy, from theology, from qualitative thinking. Now, the main challenge to the current practice of behavioral economics, as I view it, is my doubts about this program of economics as a policy science, the kind of thing that Len does so skillfully, is something that I once did, and I worry about it. Because the policy tricks, the policy dials we turn, what's the tax rate here and the tax rate there, and we're going to turn this a bit and try to get people to do it this way or that way, seem to me to be, they're not stupid, they're not evil, they're not wrong, but they don't face the real question, which the blessed Adam Smith called the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. When I'm in Russia, I have to do it the other way. And here's the order of magnitude. I told you I was a quantitative person. Since 1800, in places like Japan or Finland or Italy or the United States, income per head, real income per head, we're not talking about monetary matters here, even though this is the Volcker lecture, increased by a factor of 30. You earn 3,000% more than your ancestors. 3,000%. Not a doubling or a tripling even, but 3,000%. And that order of magnitude, and these are rough figures, of course, and you can make little criticisms around the margins, but that's the biggest secular event in human history since the domestication of plants and animals in 9 different parts of the world in the last 10,000 years before Christ. It's an astonishing increase. And that's, it seems to me, more and more what we should be focusing on. Whereas, unless I can be persuaded to the contrary, behavioral economics is a criticism of the little technical details of what I call Samuelsonian economics. The Max U, which is a joke, Max U, we call him in German, the maximizing utility under constraints assumption that is supposed to underlie standard orthodox bourgeois economics. And standard bourgeois economics can't explain a 3,000% increase. It just can't. There's a field of economics called growth theory, which doesn't explain it, even though that's what it says it does. And neither then can the criticism, the introduction of surprisingly irrational, you might say, behaviors. That's the bread and butter of behavioral economics. Neither of them. Neither the Samuelsonianism criticized, by the way, Paul Samuelson, the great economist, was my, in case you need to know, was my mother's longtime mixed doubles tennis partner. You should write that down, it's very important. But he and his brother-in-law, Kenneth Arrow, were the founders of modern economics. And by the way, their mutual nephew, Larry Summers, you can perhaps understand why Larry Summers is a little bit arrogant if you know that his uncles were Arrow and Samuelson. And that is no more adequate to explain this amazing change in the human condition, which in the next 50 years or 100 years will spread to the entire world, such that everyone on the planet has adequate nutrition, an opportunity for higher education, the ability to travel, be able to read, and to worship, and to think. So the problem is that Samuelsonian or conventional economics is supposed to be this fine-tuning mechanism, and it's, so to speak, the French and rationalist side of the Enlightenment. It's about control, about planning, about reason. And the criticisms from behavioral economics are, well, people aren't reasonable, rational. And so therefore, to get control, which the behavioral economists think, as with the conventional economists we ought to have, we've got to second guess the behavior of consumers and producers, and apparently not the economists who are making the second guessing. The only rational people in the room, according to both Samuelsonian economics, and well, that's not quite true actually, but according to behavioral economics, are the economists themselves. You all are idiots. And I'm from the government, and I'm here to help you. So the vision I'm claiming in behavioral economics is that essentially of central planning. We're going to correct your behavioral errors. We're going to show you that you're being fooled by advertising, that if there's too much clothing in your closet, it's because you're a dope and you're irrational. And when you make investments, you don't know what you're doing, and so forth. It's the vision that Vladimir Lenin had. He said that he wanted to make Russian society into a great big factory, a single factory with, guess who, in charge. Now, the other side of the Enlightenment project is the liberty side. There's the rational planning side. We'll make the world anew. We'll we'll design the world the way in a wholly new way. This was the great vision of the French Enlightenment. But in the in the Scottish Enlightenment of David Hume and Adam Smith and others, the argument was that liberty was the key new thing. That harnessing, not harnessing, that's not the word, allowing human creativity would make for improvement. Now, everyone in this room is in favor of liberty and is against slavery, the enslavement of women to men, or of African Americans to other people, to whites or whatever. But you may not have considered, and certainly even Adam Smith didn't consider, that it would result, this opening up of allowing free people to have a go, in a factor of 30, 3,000% of electric lights, inexpensive steel, cheap, inexpensive carpeting, and so forth. So it was a surprise. Now, what then is my? You can see which side I favor. I mean, you could be in favor of both sides, both the control and rational side of the Enlightenment project, and the liberty side. But I think they're in conflict. I mean, it's kind of obvious that if a bunch of economists and central planners are going to tell you what occupations you're allowed to be in, and to tell you that, sorry, the only kind of raincoats we have are green, it's obvious that liberty, your ability to make yourself with your consumption, for example, is being violated. So what then do I think is wrong with behavioral economics, aside from this overall wrongness of siding with the French? Don't ever side with the French. Freedom fries. Well, the first problem is that it strikes me as strange to redo psychology, which in some ways is a simple summary of the project of behavioral economics. The economists have come to psychology, experimental psychology, social psychology in some ways, and said, oh, good, we'll use that to talk about economics. And we'll do experiments, or we'll make points about the cognitive abilities of consumers or investors or whatever, like you psychologists do. My sister is an academic psychologist, and she doesn't think much of behavioral economics, and I always do what my younger or older sister, we have a debate in our family about which one she is. It's everything she says. Another problem is that behavioral economics supposes that the conventional Smithsonian economics, or its conclusions about the market, its conclusions about how economies work, depend on this absurdly rational being, Max-U, this maximizer, as Thorstein Veblen said scornfully, this lightning calculator responding to every slight change in the price, relative prices, running around maximizing all the time. I had a nightmare some decades ago. I'm not much inclined to them, so this was quite surprising to me. But it was a Samuelsonian economics nightmare. Namely, imagine in the world of, nightmares, that you had to do everything optimally perfectly. Marginal benefit equals marginal cost in moving your hand. So that's not right. We've got to do it. Oh, no, wait a second. Do it this way. Or taking the cup of coffee to your lips. That everything had to be perfect. Every step you take had to be just the right one. And you can see that this would drive anyone nuts. And it's the claim that the behavioral economists make about conventional economics, and indeed the unconventional economics that I'm advocating, that it's necessary. That in order for markets to work, people have to be perfectly rational. And that's false. A much more reasonable way of getting to the conclusion that free market societies in which people are allowed to have a go and try out things is an evolutionary perspective. Look, in evolutionary theory, you've got to have a source of variation. That's biology. And in our genes, it's caused by gamma rays and things like that. And in society, and certainly in the economy, it's caused by human creativity. People violating the rules. People trying out new ways of doing things, such as, to take one of my favorite examples, containerization. A man named Malcolm McLean, poor boy who hadn't been able to go to college, he was now owned a small trucking firm in North Carolina in 1956, said to himself, well, suppose we take steel, which was inexpensive by then, make sort of corrugated boxes so that they can hold loads, and then put stuff in them and pile them up and send them to China. Hey, what do you know? Containerization, which has radically changed the price of goods. So there we are. So that's number two. Now, number three, if I can read it here, I'd better get my specs out. And it's not true, therefore, that if individuals are irrational to some degree, even to a very great degree, that markets don't work. As long as markets are able to select the variations that get tried out, if containerization was a bad idea, you wouldn't hear anything more about it. As long as markets can select what works, this stumbling around, which is actually how we consume things. You only need to look at my closet to know that. It's filled with the mistakes I've made. I once bought a very short skirt. I'm not a short skirt girl. This isn't going to work for me. Long skirts are better, etc. Trying out things in production. So there's selection involved. And so this criticism that behavioral economics makes of standard economics is unpersuasive. My eyes are getting worse as I speak. All right. What behavioral economics shares with Smithsonian economics, furthermore, is a belief that markets are very imperfect. Now, understand, Smithsonian economics assumes that everyone is this perfect maximizer, according to the behavioral economists. I think they're wrong. And behavioral economics says, well, we're going to introduce realism into these assumptions about behavior. So that's the individual behavior. But let's see, I've lost my train of thought. But they share standard Samosonian economics of, say, Joe Stiglitz at Princeton, who was Paul Samoson's student, the second Nobel Prize winner to graduate from Gary, Indiana High School. Joe was. Their assumption is that markets are very imperfect. So there's no way the market's going to fix things. If you're stupid, you're doomed, because the market won't help you out. That's shared by the Samosonians and the behavioral economists. Now, the underlying argument in behavioral economics and in large fields of the intellect over in psychology is the notion that the brain is a computer, that computation rationality is what we seek in our brains. I think that, too, is wrong. I think that's a mistake. I think that a creative, innovative human being or a creative, innovative society has to have craziness in it, has to have emotions. And let's try this out. Let's play baseball instead of cricket, which I regard as a great tragedy, a national tragedy. Let's try this. Let's try dropping paint onto a canvas, a la Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock sold last year, late Jackson Pollock, for $85 million. So he's dropping paint on. Let's try that, see what happens. So a certain madness is necessary for advances in the economy or in art or in science or in music or in any of our human practices. So the model of the brain as a mechanical or calculator is unwise. Now, the claim is in behavioral economics is that this calculator goes wrong all the time. The psychologists, now hear this is quite shocking, have discerned in you all, now hear this, 257 cognitive biases. 257. That's a lot of biases. That's a lot of stupidity. And it's using this premise or these observations of stupidity that motivates behavioral economics. The idea is you're stupid, you have all these biases, the market is very imperfect, therefore it's hopeless. No, not quite, because there's a third item, the government, that can come in and save us all, can nudge us, as the behavioral economists say, or indeed, as the socialists say, compel us. So you see the structure of the argument. We're imperfectly rational, and the market is imperfect. I've actually counted, in a paper that I did, I counted the number of market imperfections that economists claim to have discovered since 1848 or so, to the number of 108 imperfections. Monopoly, informational asymmetries, failure of the capital market, blah, 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 advertising, ignorant consumers, animal spirits, whatever, all these imperfections. Now, understand, a big problem with this view of market imperfections is that since 1848, incomes per head have increased by this enormous percentage amount. Uniquely in history. It had never happened before. So there's something odd about saying, you know, you could say in Yiddish idiom, we should have such imperfections if they yield 2,000%, 3,000% increases in national income per head. If that's what imperfection of the market means, bring it on. And the psychologists to 257 cognitive biases have the same problem. If we really have, if you typically have 257 cognitive biases, how do you make it across the street? You'd be bumping into the wall all the time. Be saying, "Oh no, this is not the wall. This is something else," and you wouldn't be able to live in the world with now here's the key point: if the 257 were important. And that's my basic scientific criticism of both the Samsonian economists talking about imperfections, as they often do, or the behavioral economists talking about imperfections in the market and in your mind. I say to them, where's the evidence that these mistakes we're supposed to be making and that the market makes are big? What's your evidence? Show me the numbers. Show me how big. Show me the oomph. Show me how big these terrible mistakes are, considering that we do make it across the road. How does a behavioral economist why does a behavioral economist cross the road? He can't. Forget about it. How does the modern world arise? How does it get 3,000% increase? Forget about it. It can't. It's too imperfect. So there's a problem here. And so far I've been talking about the scientific problems, the problems with behavioral economics as a contribution to economic science. But it also has the problem, which it shares with the Samsonians in their enthusiasm for fixing up imperfections in the market. It also has ethical and political problems. If the government is going to take over our lives, if we're so terrified of what life can bring that we wish that the wise people in Washington or in Albany or in Springfield, Illinois, which is even more comical, would take over our lives. Aren't we making a political and ethical mistake? Aren't we going to infantilize people? This is in accord with what my friend Jonathan Haidt has pointed out about the excessively careful raising of children these days. When Len and I were kids, Mom would say at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, she might fix you a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for lunch. Go play. Come back when the street lights come on. And that's what we'd do. We'd wander around unsupervised. Now it's inconceivable. If you do that, child protection will descend on your house. So the excessive intrusion of the state, and in this case, again, it is the state. It's the police who come to your house. If you've let your child walk to school or something shocking like that, I used to walk to school when I was, let's see, in the 5th grade, I would walk to school. So, you know, here I am. I survived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So, you know, Cambridge was not the safest place in the world, but we walked to school. That kind of paternalism, what Bob Frank over at Cornell, close to here, and his friends in behavioral economics call paternalistic, libertarian paternalism, is, I would claim, ethically, emotionally, politically corrupting. It makes people into serfs. It makes them into less than free human beings. In aid of the French side of the Enlightenment project, it destroys the other side, the liberty. And that I regard as a quite serious problem. Now, of course, I'm an economist. I'm a worldly philosopher, as Bob Heilbronner called it so interestingly. So what should be the role of an economist if this detailed fine-tuning doesn't work out? If it's not true that you're a bunch of idiots who can't cross the street, what then is the role of the economist? And I must say, I would prefer an economics that stopped being so eager to give advice to people. Notice that the other social sciences don't. It would be a shocking violation of the ethics of anthropology for anthropologists to be in the business of telling primitive people what to do. A contrario, they watch them and say things about the nature of humans from what they have observed. The sociologists don't do it either. Maybe criminologists do, I guess, maybe, but not too many other branches of sociology. There's a little bit of policy relevance of sociology, but it's not so dominant as it is in economics, where everything you say is supposed to have policy relevance. In Adam Smith's time, the word he used for policy was police. And that's about right. For a policy by the government to have effect, for it to work, the cops have to be involved. If you don't pay your taxes, you don't follow if you try to import drugs from Canada at a quarter of the price there in the United States, you'll have an appointment with the authorities. So what should we do, we economists? Well, I think we should go back, as many of my friends in the who I would call liberals, most of you would call them libertarians, would suggest, go back to a philosophical, observational, historical role for economists. To put it another way, our advice should be constitutional. Should be advice about policy overall, not details of policy. Things like, don't impose steel tariffs mindlessly. That's funny. I wonder who would ever do that. Don't impose a tariff on solar panels that prevents the Chinese from importing them, raising the price of solar panels by a factor of 2 in the United States. Don't put little children in cages at the border. Don't. As a philosophical point, as a broader constitutional piece of advice. And that's what economics was in the 18th and 19th century. And I would prefer to get get back to it. Jane Jacobs was a great observer of urban life in the United States. And she was hostile to planning. The Robert Moses, the well-named Robert Moses in New York, and that kind of person who wanted to intervene and fine-tune economies, urban economies, by running superhighways through them. And she said that cities should be allowed to evolve, to find their way piece by piece. She was a Scot. She was a Scottish Enlightenment person. And that's my model. So we have these cognitive biases, we have these alleged failures of the market, we have all this. And then the policy conclusion of my friends, and some of them are my friends in behavioral economics, is that we should be nudged. That's their word, nudged. Now, I'm against coercion. I'm a classical liberal. I'm certainly against coercion. But I'm also against tricking people. If the government thinks that you should not drink as many sugared soft drinks, it can tell us about them and report on the scientific studies that show that excesses of sugar are bad for you and things like that. I guess I don't mind that, although the government often makes mistakes in these matters. In fact, it chronically makes mistakes. But I don't want the government tricking you either. A few years ago, by way of advice, the Swedish government, and I'm not making this up, suggested that Swedes use 2 centimeters of toothpaste on their toothbrush. 2 centimeters. Nope, wait, that's 2.1. No, take it away. And quite properly, the journalists of Sweden made merry of this suggestion. This is a stupid thing to do on the part of, I don't know, the Department of Public Health. Leave people alone. This is crazy. Why are you and if we have a free press and courts in which torts, damages can be found, that's better protection than most of the regulation proposed. In Chicago, my hometown, or my present home, there are building inspectors. And Chicago building inspectors are supposed to affirm that such and such a project is correctly done, that the concrete is of the right quality, that the plumbing is going to work, that the electricity is not going to kill people, and so forth. But of course, the building inspectors are corrupt. And so for $10 or $20, you can buy the approval of the building inspector. And that's not doing anything. We might as well abolish the building inspector law in Chicago. Because what really worries a builder is if a free press and the law of torts in courts gets after them. If their building falls down or injures someone, that is available. I'm going to work to a conclusion here. Adam Smith said, the man of system imagines that he can arrange the different members of a great society as easily as moving pieces on a chessboard. And that's the basic problem with either of these projects of social engineering. the Maxwell perfect rationality version of Samuelsonian economics and of behavioral economics. I'm not against behavioral economics as a small supplement to what we do, but I don't think it's this revolutionary new economic thinking that a lot of its advocates believe. This has an old history. People who don't want to learn the economics of David Ricardo or Alfred Marshall or Paul Samuelson and Milton Friedman, for that matter, would prefer that that be thrown away and that we institute a new economics based on reasonable characterizations of how people actually behave, the 257 cognitive errors that we're supposed to be making. And I propose a 258th cognitive error, which I call the psychologist bias. The psychologist bias. The bias to find mistakes in calculation and then concluding that people are hopeless as calculators. So, in short, I worry both about my Samuelsonian friends like Joe Stiglitz and my behavioral economics friends like Len, that they're leading us to a world in which people are not free, in which people have been infantilized, in which people become, in the scornful term from the right, snowflakes, that they're prepared to turn to their father, the state, whenever they face a problem. In fact, the very vocabulary of problems is part of the problem. So there's a problem, which is that if you think there's a problem, you automatically assume, in the French 18th century way, that there's a solution. And that, alas, dears, is not the case. There isn't always a solution. And there are few of the solutions are good for human freedom or human maturity or the flourishing of humans, which all of us want. Thank you. As you can see, look, if you had asked me for my juggling act, I would have given you a much smoother performance. But, you know, this is how ideas are forced into existence by tyrannical chairs.
So, I mean, I certainly agree with one of your main preferences, one of your main premises for policymakers, and you object to the whole idea, but policymakers shouldn't do stupid stuff.
They shouldn't do stupid stuff.
Policymakers do stuff, right?
They do stuff.
My specialty is tax policy. There are 200 subsidies in the tax code.
Yeah.
Most of them are stupid.
Of course.
So one thing behavioral economics tells us is that, well, if policymakers feel like they need to do things, there are less intrusive and less stupid ways to do them.
We're on the same page. My friend Pete Boatke at George Mason says the history of economic policy, and indeed economic philosophy, is a struggle between the three S's, or as sort of a contest. Smith about allocation, perfect efficiency. Schumpeter about innovation and stupidity, which is the force of stupid government policies wrecking things.
So one objection you have is to behavioral economics as paternalism, paternalistic libertarian paternalism. But sometimes government's trying to encourage behavior to raise social welfare. For example, people are more likely to pay their taxes if told that their neighbors are complying.
Yeah.
Sharing information is a very cost-effective way of promoting pro-social behavior.
Yeah, that's fun.
There's a paper I love by Tatiana Hominoff, who's at NYU, where she discovered that if you give people a nickel a bag to get them to bring their own bags to the grocery store, they won't do it. But if you charge them a nickel for every bag they use, they'll bring their own bags. And, you know, individually, there's not any reason why I should care whether I bring bags or not, because I'm not going to save the planet by doing it myself. But you want everybody to pay attention to the social costs of what they're doing. Behavioral economics is useful for that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, but I would argue that a lot of those issues are, they're not focusing on the really important causes of our prosperity and our flourishing, which isn't, although I am very public spirited about plastic bags. I have a bag in my hotel room, and a reusable bag, and I don't like plastic bags. They're always doubling the bag, you know what I mean? They always give you two, and in case it breaks, well, it's not the end of the world. But these are not the locus of our great prosperity, and I think you would agree. The locus of our great prosperity is the ability to try out stuff. And if we have a lot of behavioral economists, or maybe even worse, the Smithsonian economists who want to compel us, rather than running around regulating stuff, that's going to make it harder to this larger thing. I mean, we'll be okay with the bags, but innovation will stop. That's what I worry about.
Yeah, can you think of examples where behavioral economics is driving policy that's actually getting in the way of innovation? Well,
I have to admit, and you're educating me on this. I can think of lots of examples where compulsion, coercion, gets in the way of innovation. I can think of thousands of them probably. We're going to be here for the next 20 hours, aren't we? And I'll just go through them all. But you're right.
No filibusters.
If that's right, if that's been outlawed in the Senate, unfortunately. But the thing is that you're talking. Look, telling people that their neighbors pay their taxes is not coercive. It's persuasive. And I like persuasion. The 5 cents sort of trickiness about whether you make them pay for the bag or get them to bring the bag back is starts to get to be tricky. And I would rather that the government have an honest, open relationship, much smaller government than we have now with its
the alternative is what New York just did, which is banning plastic bags altogether.
Yeah.
So it's obviously less coercive than that.
And that's certainly coercive, I agree. Well, he's half persuading me. I'm not going to get converted, though, entirely, because I do disagree with behavioral economics on scientific grounds. An extreme example of this is the career of a man named Thaler, who got the Nobel Prize a few years ago, which is based on this kind of theorem that you're stupid because of the 257 biases. The market doesn't work, which is wrong. The market often does work. In fact, it was said by a famous economist of a much earlier generation that economics economizes on love. Now, I think that's mistaken, but that's what he said. Because We don't need to, as Adam Smith famously said, we don't need to love the butcher or the baker in order to make a deal with them. But actually, another thing that the market economizes on, not so much economics as a science, is on rationality. Mm-hmm. You don't need to be rational if Marshall Field's department store is on State Street in Chicago, and Marshall Fields, that was his name back in the 19th century, has a motto of give the lady what she wants and a policy of a money-back guarantee. So then you don't need tricks to fool people. You have a market substitute for the irrationality that we all engage in when we're consumers.
You said you thought that economics should move more towards observation and less towards prescription.
Yes.
Isn't that really what behavioral economics is trying to do? I don't think behavioral economics says we're stupid. Behavioral economics identifies a bunch of biases that any one of us could see ourselves. I read about behavioral economics saying, well, yeah, I've done that, I've done that, I've done that, and I don't think I'm stupid.
Yeah, I understand that, but that you say you're not stupid is correct in your personal case.
Thank you.
But that's the problem. The overall conclusion is that you're bumping around in a significant way, in an important way, that you're hurting yourself and others and can be easily nudged to prevent you from hurting yourself or others.
But it's also very empirically based. I mean, some of the results are very surprising. The bag is a good example.
An example.
I mean, in economic theory, it shouldn't make any difference whether you pay people a nickel or charge.
Well, in some kinds of economic theory, not an economic theory that's evolutionary, not an economic theory that's Austrian, not an economic theory that says, well, we're all in a kind of a daze here, where it's like the the fog of war, and we don't know what's going on. So again, there's this presumption that the only economic theory is this extreme Samuelsonianism of my nightmare. And then it's easy to attack it and say, well, come on, that's not how people are. So I don't want to nudge people, I want to persuade them. And sweet talk is how we need to go. That's the basic claim of a liberal society in the root sense of the word, a society of free people, where I'm not going to trick you into believing the Pythagorean theorem. I'm going to persuade you.
But if you could come up with a shortcut that would make it easy for me to figure out how the Pythagorean theorem works, I'd be grateful, right?
Yes, but it would be more persuasion. They're actually about 100 years before Pythagoras, the Chinese, who invented practically everything, had an excellent geometric proof of the Pythagorean theorem. By the way, there are hundreds of proofs of the Pythagorean theorem. This was a particularly elegant one. And, that's just a kind of persuasion. Look, here's another proof. Whereas the way it's proved in Euclid is this ugly stuff about odd and even numbers, which is very unpersuasive. So no, persuasion, look, here, let me put it this way. Maybe we're making some progress here. The core belief that I think everyone in this room has is that everyone here is equal, that we deserve equal dignity. And a society of free exchange and free persuasion is of that character. I offer you, as Adam Smith said, the offer of a shilling in a market is a form of persuasion, of sweet talk among equals. Whereas, now this is a point I didn't make. I'll curry and write it down and add it to the essay I'm going to do off of this speech. Your way of looking at things, j'accuse, is unequal. What's the inequality? You're the analyst looking down on the citizens. And I don't like that. And I know neither do you. I'm sure it makes you uncomfortable to be called looking down on people. So that's the worry. There's a kind of cuteness in managing other people's lives that I hope we all find a little obnoxious. Now look, if the other person's a 3-year-old, and the 3-year-old proposes to run in front of the bus, you know, coercion. I don't want to have a rational discussion with the kid. I want to just grab him and prevent him from killing himself. But it's fundamental to a free society, this entirely novel idea in the 18th century that all men, as was said by an owner of slaves who didn't even free his own children, but anyway, all men and women, dear, are created equal. That equality is being tricked by behavioral economics.
Well, so, I mean, it's not just policymakers, though, right? I mean, advertisers have used insights of behavioral science since before behavioral science even existed.
They have, and indeed it goes back to ancient Greek rhetoric, or the Talmud, or the Sanskrit grammarians, this looking back on language and noticing how people's minds are changed.
So you probably don't want to regulate advertisers.
No, I don't want to regulate.
There might be a second best argument for the government to help offset.
There we may have a more fundamental disagreement. We agree that we want this equal society, this equal dignity. But I think that you know me. I worry about the government. I have a friend, a Marxist friend named George DiMartino, who teaches at the University of Denver. He's written a very good book called The Economist's Oath. It's a wonderful book. And I was just seeing George a while ago, a few days ago. And George and I are going to do a book. He from the left, I from not the right. Do I look like a conservative? I'm not a conservative, I'm a liberal. I'm a classical liberal. And George and I are going to do a book where we talk about each other's fears. He fears the private sphere or the voluntary sphere. I fear the sphere of involuntary compulsion. And I think my case is better than George's.
I want to throw this open for questions or comments from the audience. We have some behavioral economists here who might have something to say. We have sociologists who might want to say something about the way you characterize sociological research, which I thought was actually somewhat more prescriptive than you characterize it. My colleagues here have
well, you're in a policy school. It's not surprising.
Well, in the pure sociology department, they've identified a number of social problems, and I believe they have policy solutions that they would like to advance.
You know, I'm talking about classical sociology, Durkheim, Weber.
Okay. Yeah, we don't have any of them here. Are there any questions? Yes. And please identify yourself. Wait for the microphone and identify yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Mirja Khanturdif. I'm a PhD student here, School of Education. I'm a Maxwell alum, Public Administration. My question is about, based on my very limited knowledge about behavioral economics and the nudging, I know this through nudgings, some people develop some certain habits, and those habits continue, and in long term, it will benefit them to make a better decisions for themselves. But when you said if you prefer more a persuasion approach, but persuasion is mostly maybe people have to be more mindful, thoughtful, and be conscious about decisions. But I don't know, maybe you may know better. Does it also turn into habit, comparing to a nudge?
That's an interesting observation, and that may well be true. We could find out. Yeah, that's right. Although, of course, I think you and I would agree that the habits of persuasiveness are very desirable to evoke, to call out in a society. That we should be trying to get people to be active learners and to listen, really listen to their friends' objections, right? Whereas the path of behavioral incentives, whether the Smithsonian economist incentives or the behavioral economist incentive, starts to sound a little bit like training rats, doesn't it? And it's true that the rat will develop a very strong desire to press the lever to get the food pellet. I get it. And reasoning with the rat is not going to work. Sweet talk to rats doesn't have much effect. But we're human beings. And it's our glory to be persuadable, to change our minds.
Robert? Wait for the microphone, please.
I just have two questions. One is, how do you persuade, Robert Ashford, College of Law, how do you persuade people?
Hi, Bob. Nice to see you.
How are you? Nice to see you, and thank you for a wonderful lecture. Two questions, unrelated. How do you persuade people or corporations not to profitably despoil the river downstream, the ozone layer, the environment for the next generation? How do you persuade them to this? That's one question. And then the other question, which is related to your critique of Samuelsonian economics and also behavioral economics, it'd be good if you explain to people your theory that explains the 3,000-fold increase in per capita growth.
Well, I have on the second question, this wonderful book, is available on Amazon.com cheap. Furthermore, amazingly, the 3 volumes, I was quite astonished by this, are available as spoken books. They were going to get a man actor to read them, and I said, oh, no. It has to be a woman. And that's it. But how do you persuade the polluters and so forth? Well, for one thing, you should try to persuade them. You should shame them in the press. Then you should, if that doesn't work, you should go to the courts and sue them for torts as a lawyer. You can understand that. And you should, then what you might do in a kind of Coasian way is construct property rights to give people the incentive to sue or to buy and sell, to make deals with the steel mill or whatever it is. And only in the last, if they're still misbehaving, then I agree you have to bring in the cops. But I would want to do all these other things first for many, look, the ozone layer problem was very alarming. It's caused by air conditioning fluid, and of all things, hairspray was causing the ozone layer over the North and South Pole, especially South Pole, to weaken and get the hole to get bigger and bigger, and eventually we'd all die of skin cancer. Well, barakad, let's do something about it. And by international agreement, as you know, it was solved. And among the leaders was someone who believes a lot of what I said, namely Margaret Thatcher, a big user of hairspray, by the way. And I think that's a model. I'm an enthusiast for Eleanor Ostrom's way of talking about this, the only woman who's won the Nobel Prize in economics. Her proposal is that these problems not be immediately solved by compulsion, but by talk. That we get together and try to work out practical solutions. And, you know, some people, I have an acquaintance who said, well, restaurants will let rat feces, is that how you pronounce rat shit if you want, into their soup if we don't have restaurant inspectors, which I think is crazy. I mean, restaurant inspectors are completely ineffective. They show up once a year, and this is ridiculous. But what exactly is the incentive for a restaurant to put rat poop in its food? So I think what I'm recommending is to not go to the fist and the gun immediately.
But the restaurant might think that
maybe poop tastes good.
They can save money by not cleaning as much, and people won't really notice.
But they'll notice when their name appears in the paper as the restaurant that poisons its people. And you know, look, if you're going to have the government do it, I think you will completely agree with me, because that was your job, or is your job in Washington. The efficacy of the government intervention has to be measured too. It's not enough to say, well, we got a problem here. Joe Stiglitz, whom I've mentioned a couple of times, is an amiable guy, but he's a theoretician. He's a blackboard person. And Joe says that any externality should be solved by the government. Now, suppose I wore to this event, instead of this very nice black thing, I wore a burnt orange dress. The older people here...
we were thinking you were paying homage to the orange.
That's right. Well, that's true, but I hope your color's not burnt orange. Maybe it is. I don't think so.
Yeah, more like this tie.
More like this tie. That's right. That's more like it. But burnt orange is a particularly ugly 1970s color, and it would be an externality. So wait a second. Should we have a clothing police? So you have to ask what the efficacy and justice, both, of the government intervention is.
Yeah.
Oh, good, a female voice. It's not working. This is our oldest electronic technology. It often breaks.
There we go.
Hi, I'm Devin Ottman. Just I'm an admitted MPA student. I was wondering, so you mentioned there was a 3,000% increase per head since the 1800s sometime, right?
Yep.
Okay. I was curious why you didn't mention if this was a constant growth or if there were certain time periods where it shot up or went down a lot, and any theories you have about that.
Well, since 1800 in the United States, there have been 40 recessions. 40. So I'll get behind the blackboard and do it for you. Let me see, which way should I go? Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, this way. It's gone like this. It's scalloped. Goes up and up and up, factor of 20 or 30. Well, yeah, but each recession, each sometimes as bad as 2008, once as bad as the 1930s, the next peak is higher than the previous peak every single time. This is one of the things that Marx said that was wrong. As I said, I admire Marx. I was a Marxist, and he was a very good social scientist, but he got everything wrong. And one of them is the immiserization of the proletariat. It's never happened. The worst case was the 1930s, which in some countries was not as bad as the United States. It wasn't as bad in Britain as it was in the United States. So there are ups and downs, but they're not. The downs are not permanent. They're bad, and if there was some way you could snap your fingers and prevent it, even nudging, I guess I'd want to do it. But I think that the ups and downs are caused by the inherent dynamism, well, that's a kind of vague way of putting it, by the innovativeness of a market-oriented economy. People are trying out things. They get enthusiastic. The dot-com boom is a more or less perfect example of this. And they go too far. And then, whoo, then there's a downturn. And then they say, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't have had as many dot-com corporations. And it comes back up. And then they get crazy about housing. And whoo, it goes down, and then it goes up. And whoo, whoo, whoo. They overbuild the railways. They overbuilt the canals. The Erie Canal was one of the few successful canals in the United States.
Hi, I'm Brianna Hugh. I would like to first start by saying thank you for joining us today and spreading your knowledge.
Glad to be here.
Second,
knowledge is like manure. It has to be spread around.
My question for you was, you talked about how you mentioned subsidies were kind of stupid, but as a business major, I had a question. What would you, how do you propose countries protect themselves against other countries, and how does that maintain a
Protect
country's
themselves
economics?
in what sense, dear? Huh? You mean from military invasion?
Just in terms of keeping their economics, a nation's economics healthy, I guess, because we learned in international business that some level of subsidy is required or necessary, at least in class.
Well, you're speaking to an economist, and most economists disagree with that. I mean, rather completely. I don't believe that. Here's an example. The Export-Import Bank is a scandalous piece of corporate welfare. That's one. The Jones Act, which prevents, which protects U.S. flag ships. This is crazy. I was once a member of the National Maritime Union. I was. And there were no more jobs for Americans because Lascars and so on are much cheaper than Americans. So no, protection, we don't need to be protected against the Chinese, for example. This is lunacy. Free trade is best. Just like, look, would you think it would be good for music to be protected against new music? Would you like painting to be protected against new painting? Would you like old science to be protected? You know, we're not going to do any of that Einstein stuff. Let's stick with Newton. We're going to put a tax on Einstein and prevent this crazy non-Newtonian stuff from getting a grip. And I think the analogy is perfect with business innovation. Laissez-faire, laissez-passer.
I think this is the last question.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been in a Bible group that has looked at nonviolence from the point of view of René Girard's critical theory, kind of a new anthropology of looking at the Bible, but devolving or bringing up mimetic theory in terms of people copying other people, mirroring other people, and then asking what dynamics of consumerism, and what I'll throw in here besides kind of raising where they play is, I really believe we don't pay enough attention to the high energy society we've lived in for the last 50 years. And I think just the sensory load and the variety of life that we've lived through tends to give us less reflective thinking in terms of evaluating where we are.
Yeah.
So if you throw this out, like we're copying what we hear or see, and we have consumerism taking on its own life, I'm saying the economy is overblown.
No, I don't think so. You know, you hear a lot about consumerism, But I urge you to consult on this matter of consumerism with cultural anthropologists. And the basic message of cultural anthropology is that all consumption is ceremonial. That, of course, you eat to get calories. Of course we do. But everything humans do is symbolically loaded. Everything. And it's not necessarily competitive. It's not necessarily a war of all against all to be have the most beautiful makeup or something, but it is deeply symbolic. And so there's no such, I don't believe there's any such thing as consumerism. I've written in some of my other wonderful books against, I'm an American. I believe in commercial free speech, not commercial free speech, but commercial free speech.
You're nudging us to buy your book.
I'm nudging you to buy my book, but I'm not the government.
Thank you so much for coming and
Thank you. Thank you, Deirdre. That was a good conversation.